Welcome to Taxpayer Empowerment. I'm Jose Melendez, Campaign Director for the Taxpayer Protection Project at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Today we're joined by one of the most influential economists in the country on urban policy and housing. Edward Glaeser is the Fred and Eleanor Glimp Professor of Economics at Harvard University. His work has shaped how policymakers think about cities, housing supply, and the relationship between regulation and affordability. Professor Glaeser, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on.
So let's get started. Let's jump right in. Across the country, we're seeing a lot of Americans that are feeling the pressure of rising housing costs, whether it's young people, renters, first-time homebuyers. They're all struggling with this crisis. So tell us, from a very high level, what's driving the housing affordability crisis here in the United States?
So you're exactly right. Housing unaffordability, the inability for ordinary middle-income Americans to buy a great house in a great neighborhood, was originally a thing of the coast. So when I started working on housing 25 years ago, this was a phenomenon in New York, this was a phenomenon in California, but most of the rest of America was basically fine. And it was basically fine because we built enough housing. It was fine because, in cities like Austin, like Dallas, like Phoenix, like Miami, we built just an extraordinary amount of housing. Over the last 25 years, though, we've seen much less building, particularly after the global financial crisis in 2006. And increasingly, places like Phoenix and places like Miami and places like Atlanta have gotten out of reach for ordinary Americans. And it's fundamentally about demand, robust demand for particularly successful metropolitan areas colliding against fixed supply. And you really see this, right, in the data. You just look at what's happened to building permits at the national level. We were at an annual rate of as much as 2 million permits in 2005, 2006. And over the last 15 years, we've rarely gotten up to 1 million permits. And another way of seeing this is if we had built housing at the same rate between 2000 and 2020 that we did between 1980 and 2000, we would have 15 million more units. Now, there's a really simple economics 101 way to understand whether a problem is about demand or about supply. If price is up and quantity is up, then it's demand, right? So when you see a robust increase in the amount of electricity being generated for data centers and you see the price of electricity going up, right, that's reflecting the demand of entities like Uber and Facebook to sort of try to crack the AI thing and just using massive amounts of energy. That's demand. By contrast, in housing, you see rising prices and declining quantities, declining new production of housing. That means it's supply.
So there's a lot of debate that's going on right now in the housing space, about the rise of housing costs, whether it's interest rates, inflation, or even corporate ownership. But your research has been pretty consistent, and it goes back to one thing, and that's supply. So talk for a moment and explain why supply matters so much.
So, I'm a sort of market basics fundamentalist. And, when a good can be produced at $80 a square foot, right, and there's no fundamental barriers to it, prices stay pretty close to $80 a square foot. And if you go back to Texas in 2003, that describes reality. Right, is that basically you could build as many houses as you wanted at $80 a square foot. And so how could the price possibly be $200 a square foot or $300 a square foot? The builders would just build more. That's really changed. Of course, even the baseline prices are much higher. Even the construction costs are higher. But the prices are increasingly detached from what construction costs are. And that's because of the increasing difficulty of building in the more attractive inner medium density areas. So, in the 1990s, places like Scottsdale in the Phoenix metro area or Buckhead in the Atlanta metropolitan area, these were places that built a lot of housing. In the past 15 years, they've built much less. And I think the way I understand this is that, what's happened in these areas is they're a tremendous American success story, as Austin is, as Dallas is, right? Tremendous American economic engine. But as educated people have moved in. They've done what educated people knew how to do in California and Massachusetts for decades, which is they know how to stop building. And so as they came in, these areas became increasingly difficult to mass produce housing in, and supply dried up and prices rose.
So a big part of your work focuses on land use regulations, permitting, zoning, density restrictions and the such. What are these policies doing to drive up the costs, and which one of these regulations would you say have a bigger impact in terms of affecting our affordability?
So how do I know that regulation plays a major role in this? Well, there are a couple of different ways you can do this. You can look across metropolitan areas, and you do indeed find the prices are higher in those metropolitan areas that have higher measures on things like the Wharton Index of land use regulations. You can look within metropolitan areas, and you do indeed see that cities that have more draconian land use rules, like, for example, larger minimum lot sizes, those have less building. But you can also use economics. And so one of the things that I did 25 years ago was I tried to figure out what would the basic economics tell us that would happen in the absence of regulation. And, as I suggested, it's that price would come close to marginal cost. But here's the rub, that most of America, marginal cost involves land as well. So you've got to actually add to your property. You need really great data on land to figure that out. By contrast, adding more space in Manhattan doesn't require more land because you can always add up an extra story. So every time you're building a new building, instead of building 10 stories, you build 11 or you build 12. And so what that says is in a competitive market that wasn't regulated, the price of a square foot of condo space in Manhattan should equal the price of physical construction for the 11th story. And Joe Jerko and Raven Sachs and I, 24 odd years ago, gathered this data, and we found that the price to buy was about double what the price to build was. And we thought that was incompatible with any view other than the fact that the idea that regulation is bearing this. There's more recently a very nice paper by John Gruber of MIT and Evan Soltis of Princeton, which looks at the difference of the price of land in Los Angeles when the permits have been gathered for it and where they don't have permits. And that pretty much just shows you straight out the difference in those land values, which is very considerable, shows you the value that land buyers put on having the permitting process gotten through. And so it suggests the importance of regulation in terms of driving up prices. Which land use regulations, which rules are most important? They're the ones that prevent the most units. So in high density areas, it's whatever makes it difficult to go to 20 stories instead of 10. In low density areas, it's whatever makes it difficult to just pack in units. So I tend to think minimum lot sizes are very powerful. But make no mistake, if you think that you're going to go at this just from the top down and say, oh, you locality can't use this thing, they'll figure out some other way to say no. They'll decide it's a wetlands or it's a historic area or it's some other thing, right, if they want to prevent housing. And so it's very hard to just think that you're going to change the rules from the top and stop localities that don't want to build from stopping the building.
You made a good point there at the end, and I kind of want to turn to Texas. Something we hear in Texas quite a bit is the need for local control. It's kind of like this guiding principle. But some would say that when local government restricts housing, it has statewide economic impact, right? And so when you think about that, when should the state correctly step in and change or even override some of these local housing restrictions? And what does that look like? What does smart reform from the state level look like down to the local level?
So I want to just reframe this slightly, which is okay. I don't like the framing of state control versus local control. I like the framing of individual property rights and the protection of individual property rights. And what this is fundamentally about is not about taking away local control and the state trying to micromanage. The state's simply trying to protect the rights of individual property owners from being expropriated by overly regulatory local environments. So that's how I would frame it, really not about sort of state versus local. States have, as all levels of government, have a role in protecting individual freedom from various forms of expropriation. I think that's fundamentally what we're talking about. So I think that there are a couple of different strategies that states have done. And there are sort of two big ones, one of which is providing incentives for localities to build. And that's a sort of light touch thing. I don't know that it's ever been that successful, but it tends not to create blood in the streets. Localities don't mind facing some form of an incentive system. So, for example, in the current housing legislation that's working its way through Congress, there's a provision which I was involved in, which both Senator Kennedy of Louisiana and Senator Warren of Massachusetts were involved in, which is about tying community development block grants to building at the local level. And so this is an example of creating some financial incentive for our larger communities to permit more housing. There are other ways of doing it, though, which are stronger. So, for example, in Massachusetts, since the 1960s, we've had something called Chapter 40B, which is a rule that says that if a community isn't allowing, any reasonably priced housing, then developments can just bypass local rules altogether and build according to the state rules if they abide by certain constraints, one of which is including a fair amount of affordable housing. California has something equivalent, which is if localities don't build enough, and California, of course, because it's much more intrusive, has a quota of what you're supposed to build in California. If you're in violation of your quota, developers may have access to something that's called the builder's remedy, which is basically, again, bypassing local controls. And so those are the two main ways. You basically have a parallel state system, or you create some form of financial incentives. You could also start by saying, we're just going to create a couple of simple rules that you're not allowed to violate at the local level, like you can't have minimum lot sizes that are less than, half an acre or something like that. Those are also that are more than half an acre for minimum lot sizes, or other things of that form. But be advised, whatever you do that's of that form, a locality that wants to prevent housing will be able to do it. And the shame of this is that, Texas has been so great at providing affordable housing for ordinary Americans for so many decades. Almost 20 years ago, I wrote an article in something called City Journal that said, Houston, New York's got a problem, where I compared what it was like to be a middle-income couple in Houston and New York City. And I even said the middle-income couple earned more. I think it was $140,000 as opposed to $120,000 a year. Keep in mind, this is 20 years ago. And the fact was, when you did the math, this middle-income couple in New York was eking out an existence on the edge of survival. They faced a horrendous commute. They faced a tiny home. They were anxious about their schools for their kids, right? It was all very, very tough. In Houston, they were living a comfortable middle-class lifestyle in a neighborhood with good homes, with a commute that was quite reasonable. And it wasn't that the taxes were the problem. It was that the housing costs were the problem, because New York's state and local taxes, while enormously high on upper income people, are actually not particularly binding on lower income people at all. And so they skated by that. What they didn't skate by was the huge cost of owning a home or renting a home in New York City.
Professor Glaeser, let's keep talking about how great Texas is.
Absolutely.
You spoke about the Houston model. When I think about my involvement in the housing policy space over the last 3 years, Houston is consistently used as that model. Back in the late 90s, as you know, they did away with a lot of these zoning restrictions, and it gave about, not just more housing, but all different kinds of housing. And that was used as the guiding principle for our housing reforms here at the state legislature. Texas is generally known as that state that has lower housing costs, more so than other large states, but that's due in part to us having fewer regulatory barriers at the local level and more willingness to build. So from your perspective, what has Texas done right, and where is there still room for improvement?
So I worry more about what Texas has done right is that it just made it easy to mass produce housing on a grand scale. I mean, you look at something like the Woodlands, which didn't exist when George Mitchell dreamed it up, 60 years ago, and now it's a huge success story. And just the ability to mass produce housing on that kind of a scale and to create a community that's, it's an amazing thing that this thing has risen out of nothing. And what I so love about this is because it's close to the airport, it particularly makes space for people who need to travel, often for immigrants who are actually bringing a lot to the economy. So think sort of, Indian engineers, that like a population like that. And what I love about that is that it shows Texas as making an America that's still a country for outsiders, right? When one way that I think about this is there's a book by an economist sadly passed away named Manker Olson called The Rise and Decline of Nations that he published 40 years ago. And he tells a tale about how stable societies get captured by their insiders who put up all sorts of rules and barriers to prevent anyone from competing with them. So you want to think the housing equivalent of this is I've moved into my nice Los Angeles neighborhood and I don't want any more building near me. So we've put up protect the, insert your animal here policy that says no one can build nearby. And
Right.
consequently, no one's going to build near you, and you're entirely protected. You're great. Your housing prices have gone up phenomenally over the last 50 years. Not only that, Prop 13 has made sure that you get to keep your low property tax values, but outsiders can't find space. What is, and so that's exactly Olson's story. Now, when I read this book in 1990, it sounded like the examples that he put forward, pre-Meiji Restoration Japan, England before Margaret Thatcher. Maybe it sounded like New York and California. It didn't sound like most of America to me, and it certainly didn't sound like Texas, where in fact outsiders can still find their space precisely because we've empowered ordinary builders to try and make a buck. Right. This is not like, it's not like that people who are providing affordable housing are great altruists. That's not what we're doing. We're using this incredible superpower, which is, the capitalist economy, to actually just build enormous amounts of housing. And that's been what Texas has gotten right. They've decided they're going to just let people build. And, sometimes it works out well for the builders. I often feel that Houston's commercial housing market is always in the throes of another near collapse because they've always overbuilt, right? Which is, part of the wonder of this whole thing. But the job of a functioning economy is not to stop the occasional builder from being over-optimistic. Over-optimism is, an inherent part of the development industry, right? It goes with every great builder that's ever existed has been over-optimistic in their dreams. And the great thing about that over-optimism is it delivers affordability for ordinary people. Because when we say that the commercial real estate industry in Houston is on the edge of a crisis, that means that rents are about to come down. And so that's actually great for ordinary customers. And of course, the equivalent for ordinary home buyers are that, it's still easy to buy a home in Houston. And, we saw a tremendous run up in Austin, particularly during the pandemic, where, there were many years in which Austin, by many measures, felt like it was the most successful large metro in America, right? And in fact, there's on the hardcover version of the book that I wrote during COVID, Survival of the City, is actually an image of Austin. And then when I came to do a quantitative look of which cities had done well or poorly during COVID, Austin headed the list for the first couple of years. But we know that prices have come down in part because at least parts of Austin have allowed building. So I think the goal here is just to make sure that enough of Texas makes it easy to build. And I just worry a lot about Texas going the way of Phoenix, or even worse, the way of Los Angeles.
So, Professor Glaeser, for a final question, let's talk about housing policy. As you know, that housing policy, spans all levels of government. So, when you think about what the role of the federal government should be in the housing space, how does the federal government address affordability, and where does the state and local government step in? Where are they better positioned to lead?
So, if you want to be in the business of providing housing support for poor families with young children, right, to try to make sure they get in a better neighborhood through something like Section 8 housing vouchers, I think that's something that almost assuredly has got to happen at the federal level, right? We should not be expecting state and localities to deliver that. I'm not saying that necessarily we want to have that policy, but whatever policy one wants to do that's in that space, that should largely be a federal policy. That's a policy, by the way, also which works much better in states where housing is elastically supplied, like Texas, because allowing housing vouchers to occur doesn't then push up housing prices, which it will in a more elastic state. In terms of encouraging building in places like California, I think there's a modest role for the federal government to do on that, because when California makes it difficult to build, the whole country is impoverished. I mean, with all due respect to the greatness of Texas, like by most measures, the most productive place on the planet is Silicon Valley. And, but it's of course a place that, it finds it very difficult to grow precisely because they have so many regulations around everything, including housing. Now, I think there's a national case to lean against that and to make it easier to build in coastal California. And that's the point of having these community development block grants that are tied to local building. But let's face it, it's very hard to sort of get from the federal government to local land use regulations. You've got the states in the middle, and the federal government doesn't naturally speak to local localities. So if you're going to put barriers on local economies from over-regulating landowners, that's got to be a state initiative. And I think the California state legislature is the front line of the largest battles of this, because California is just so far gone in making it difficult to build. But I think equally important are the states like Texas, which have been beacons of freedom for individual property owners for so many centuries. And it's also important that the state legislature take acts that protect individual freedom from the encroachment by local governments.
Excellent. Professor Glaeser, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for bringing so much clarity to one of the most pressing issues that are facing our country today, which is housing affordability. That will do it for this episode of Taxpayer Empowerment. Join us again next time.